and today I shall be reading the climactic chapter from Laurence Sterne's A Sentimental Journey, The Case of Delicacy. When you have gained the top of Mount Torira, you run presently down to Lyon. Adieu then to all rapid movements. 'Tis a journey of caution, and it fares better with sentiments not to be in a hurry with them. So I contracted with a voiturin to take his time with a couple of mules and convey me in my own chaise safe to Turin through Savoy. Poor, patient, quiet, honest people, fear not your poverty. The treasury of your simple virtues will not be envied you by the world, nor will your valleys be invaded by it. Nature, in the midst of thy disorders, thou art still friendly to the scantiness thou hast created. With all thy great works about thee, little hast thou left to give, either to the scythe or to the sickle. But to that little thou grantest safety and protection, and sweet are the dwellings which stand so sheltered. Let the way-worn traveller vent his complaints upon the sudden turns and dangers of your roads, your rocks, your precipices, the difficulties of getting up, the horrors of getting down, mountains impracticable, and cataracts which roll down great stones from their summits and block his road up. The peasants had been all day at work in removing a fragment of this kind between Saint-Michel and Madame, and by the time my voiturin got to the place, it wanted full 2 hours of completing before a passage could anyhow be gained. There was nothing but to wait with patience. 'Twas a wet and tempestuous night, so that by delay, and that together, the voiturin found himself obliged to take up 5 miles short of his stage, at a little decent kind of an inn by the roadside. I forthwith took possession of my bedchamber, got a good fire, ordered supper, and was thanking heaven it was no worse, when a voiture arrived with a lady in it, and her servant maid. As there was no other bedchamber in the house, the hostess, without much nicety, led them into mine, telling them, as she ushered them in, that there was nobody in it but an English gentleman, that there were 2 good beds in it, and a closet within the room which held another. The accent in which she spoke of this 3rd bed did not say much for it. However, she said there were 3 beds and 3 people, and she dare say the gentleman would do anything to accommodate matters. I left not the lady a moment to make a conjecture about it, so instantly made a declaration I would do anything in my power. As this did not amount to an absolute surrender of my bedchamber, I still felt myself so much the proprietor as to have a right to do the honours of it. So I desired the lady to sit down, pressed her into the warmest seat, called for more wood, desired the hostess to enlarge the plan of the supper, and to favour us with the very best wine. The lady had scarce warmed herself 5 minutes at the fire before she began to turn her head back and give a look at the beds. And the oftener she cast her eyes that way, the more they returned perplexed, I felt for her, and for myself. For in a few minutes, what by her looks and the case itself, I found myself as much embarrassed as it was possible the lady could be herself. That the beds we were to lay in were in one and the same room was enough simply by itself to have excited all this. But the position of them, for they stood parallel and so very close to each other as only to allow space for a small wicker chair betwixt them, rendered the affair still more oppressive to us. They were fixed up, moreover, near the fire, and the projection of the chimney on one side and a large beam which crossed the room on the other formed a kind of recess for them that was in no way favourable to the nicety of our sensations. If anything could have added to it, it was that the two beds were both of them so very small, so to cut us off from every idea of the lady and the maid lying together, which in either of them could it have been feasible, my lying besides them, though a thing not to be wished, yet there was nothing in it so terrible which the imagination might not have passed over without torment. As for the little room within, it offered little or no consolation to us. 'Twas a damp, cold closet with a half-dismantled window shutter, and with a window which had neither glass or oil paper in it to keep out the tempest of the night. I did not endeavour to stifle my cough when the lady gave a peep into it, so it reduced the case in course to this alternative, that the lady should sacrifice her health to her feelings and take up with the closet herself and abandon the bed next mine to her maid, or that the girl should take the closet, etc., etc. The lady was a Piedmontese of about 30 with a glow of health in her cheeks. The maid was a Lyonnaise of 20 and as brisk and lively a French girl as ever moved. There were difficulties every way, and the obstacle of the stone in the road which brought us into the distress, great as it appeared while the peasants were removing it, was but a pebble to what lay in our ways now. I have only to add that it did not lessen the weight which hung upon our spirits, that we both were too delicate to communicate what we felt to each other upon the occasion. We sat down to supper, and had we not had more generous wine to it than a little inn in Savoy could have furnished, our tongues had been tied up, till necessity herself had set them at liberty. But the lady, having a few bottles of Burgundy in her voiture, sent down her fille de chambre for a couple of them, so that by the time supper was over and we were alone, we felt ourselves inspired with a strength of mind sufficient to talk, at least without reserve, upon our situation. We turned it every way and debated and considered it in all kinds of lights in the course of a 2-hour negotiation, at the end of which the articles were settled finally betwixt us and stipulated for in form and manner of a treaty of peace, and I believe with as much religion and good faith on both sides as in any treaty which as yet had the honour of being handed down to posterity. They were as follows. First, as the right of the bedchamber is with the monsieur, and he thinking the bed next to the fire to be the warmest, he insists upon the concession on the lady's side of taking up with that bed. Granted, on the part of Madame, with a proviso, that as the curtains of that bed are of a flamsy, transparent cotton, and appear likewise too scanty to draw close, that the fille de chambre shall fasten up the opening either by corking pins or needle and thread in such a manner as shall be deemed a sufficient barrier on the side of monsieur. Secondly, it is required on the part of Madame that monsieur shall lay the whole night through in his robe de chambre. Rejected, inasmuch as monsieur is not worth a robe de chambre, he having nothing in his portmanteau but 6 shirts and a black silk pair of breeches. The mentioning of the silk pair of breeches made an entire change of the article, for the breeches were accepted as an equivalent for the robe de chambre, and so it was stipulated and agreed upon that I should lay in my black silk breeches all night. Thirdly, it was insisted upon and stipulated for by the lady that after monsieur was got to bed and the candle and fire extinguished, that monsieur should not speak one single word the whole night. Granted, provided monsieur's saying his prayers might not be deemed an infraction of the treaty. There was but one point forgot in the treaty, and that was the manner in which the lady and myself should be obliged to undress and get to bed. There was but one way of doing it, and that I leave to the reader to devise, protesting as I do it, that if it is not the most delicate in nature, 'tis the fault of his own imagination, against which this is not my first complaint. Now, when we got to bed, whether it was the novelty of the situation or what it was, I know not. But so it was, I could not shut my eyes. I tried this side and that, and I turned and turned again till a full hour after midnight, when nature and patience both wearing out. "Oh my God," said I. "You have broke the treaty, monsieur," said the lady, who had no more slept than myself. I begged her 1,000 pardons, but insisted that it was no more than ejaculation. She maintained 'twas an entire infraction of the treaty. I maintained it was provided for in the clause of the 3rd article. The lady would by no means give up her point, though she weakened her barrier by it, for in the warmth of the dispute I could hear 2 or 3 corking pins fall out of the curtain to the ground. "Upon my word and honour, madam," said I, stretching my arm out of bed by way of asseveration. I was going to have added that I would not have trespassed against the remotest idea of decorum for the world. But the fille de chambre, hearing there were words between us and fearing that hostilities would ensue in course, had crept silently out of her closet, and it being totally dark, had stolen so close to our beds that she had gone herself into the narrow passage which separated them, and had advanced so far up as to be in a line between her mistress and me, so that when I stretched out my hand, I caught hold of the fille de chambre's. End of volume 2.